Hi guys, this is the Definite Article here for Grinder School, and today I'm just going to be recording a hand review video. I've got a ton of hands played over the last week or so, and hopefully this will be not like my previous hand review videos in which we talked in incredible depth about particular spots and got through about 3 hands in 45 minutes, but rather more like a live play video, except there's only interesting hands to talk about. Some of these I've marked are just because they're a bit ridiculous in terms of result, but hopefully there shouldn't be too many of those. And I don't think we're going to get through the entire bunch, but we should get through a decent chunk. Also, this video will probably be recorded in 2 parts, so it may sound slightly different about 20 minutes through, but I don't think that should be a problem. So here, this is just this is a hand played at 100 NL. He's not six-axing middle position, but most of the hands in this video will be played at 50 NL, and we make a pretty standard call from the button. He's opening 20% in middle position, so that's pretty wide. It's certainly on the wider side, and I'm just going to grab some notes here, because I think that was probably one of the weaknesses of my last hand review video. In this I didn't use notes because I used the notes from PokerStars. So here we have so I didn't have all these notes at the time I took the hand, so we have essentially no relevant notes on the hand, and I'll just talk about notes if we ever use any during this. When he checks a flop, we expect his range to be fairly weak. He's c-betting 65%, and the reason why this indicates a weak range is that normally by the time he gets 50 NL, 100 NL, people's betting ranges tend to be fairly balanced. Thus, they need to be betting a very wide value range to have a high-ish c-bet percentage as he does. He's only folding to a third of float bets, but that's over a very small sample, only 3 hands. So I think this hand's a very decent bet. I think a lot of his checks are going to be hands like Ace King that beat us, and I don't think it's a bad result if you fold out King Jack or whatever. Although I would say that checking this flop is certainly a reasonable play at times. I'd rather do it with a slightly better Ace-X of spades, probably Ace-Jack of spades, because we'd 3-bet Ace-King of spades against the 20% middle position open. When he check raises flop, we expect his range to be honest, either complete spew or just pretty strong. You don't really tend to get massive population tendencies about how people construct their ranges for doing this type of thing. So we can expect to see 1 or 2 flush draws in his range. So realistically, considering our blockers, he can only really have King Jack of spades in his flop, in his pre-flop range. That's a flush draw here, maybe 7-6 of spades. But also, it would be very unusual for him to check raise queens here. Possibly 8s or 4s he might check raise and apart from that he just has spats. But because this guy seemed fairly passive in bluff spots, I'm not assigning him a wide spats range. However, I think our hand is clearly strong enough to call. We're probably getting implied odds against the sets, and clearly binking the turn. We knew we were going to bink the turn, so that makes the call good in itself. He bets the turn pretty big. Now, how we play this turn depends on how we assess his range. If we think he just always has assessor flush here, then the best play is to jam, or at least raise. Perhaps jamming this deep might be a bit much. He might start folding sets for a 5x jam. However, we don't know that about his range. Certainly, we can assign him a fair few spew combos, and, well, 1 or 2 spew combos, and we want to let him continue spewing rivers. However, I think we can give him more flush and set combos than anything else here. So let's say 1 combo of King Jack suited, and let's give him a total of 6 set combos and 2 spew combos. So I think against that range, just for the times that we get an extra street out of his spew, or get to stack a weaker flush easier, or maybe even get more money out of sets, I think calling is better. I think if he has exclusively sets and flushes there, though, raising is definitely better. Clearly this isn't the best river for us. He boats up with a loss of his range. And if we're right to give him 6 combos of sets, 2 of spew and 1 of flushes on the previous street, and we have to assume that A, he slows down with some of his spew, so let's give him 1.5 combos of spew, but B, this is always jamming his sets, because we'll be perceived to have a fair few flush in his range here. So when he jams it slightly over the sides of the pot, I think it's a fairly decent spot to make an exploitative fold. His range should just be ridiculously strong here. I think his sizing is too big for that reason. I wouldn't expect him to have enough bluffs in his range, so that as the hero with a bluff catcher, we can't just fold our entire range here. Our entire bluff catching range. Opening ace-4 off in a small blind, this is back at 50 NL. Pretty standard. So flop 7-7-2 rainbow, and you can either check or bet here. I think it's probably fine to do either. But if you check, you obviously have to check call, because your checking range is probably going to be not that strong in terms of pair hands. You might check pocket 8 from time to time, you might check ace-2, but realistically, if you check fold ace-4 here, then you're folding a huge percentage of the time that you check. So I think after checking, we have to check call. We turn to gut shots, and although this hand is pretty weak in absolute terms, I think when he bets again, it's a decent spot to check call again. The reason for this is that we don't expect him to. There isn't a whole lot of difference between this hand and ace-2, and against his betting range, we have probably more robust equity. With this and ace-2, certainly they're both vulnerable to the same cards. If he has overcards, then they have the same equity against ace-2 as ace-4. But when we're behind here, we can hit a gut shot or an ace. Whereas with a 2, we have to hit a 2, and sometimes that's not going to be good as often, especially considering we can expect him to be betting twice with all his 7x here. So I think this is probably a better hand to call twice with than it looks like. We will have some flush draws, but I still think if we start folding ace, jack, etc. here, it's going to be preferable to call with ace-4 than those hands. So we do call again, and we river a straight. Now, clearly we don't really want to lead this river. Our range looks pretty condensed here. We shouldn't have very many nutted hands, but we shouldn't have very many air hands either. Sometimes you have quads, I guess, but that's basically it. And I'm going to bet quads a very decent portion of the time on this flop, blind against blind, because his pre-flop range is wide enough that he's going to have to call with a flop bet with a much wider range than a 7, and thus our 7 blockers don't really come into play when we do have quads. So we don't have a strong enough range to start donk betting. Our opponent certainly has range advantage, so we'd start by checking. He bets again, and I think this is pretty close between calling and jamming. If we think he starts folding a 7 to a jam, then I think it's clearly a fold, a call. If we think he's never folding a 7, I think it's clearly a jam, because he should have basically all the combos of ace-7 through queen 7, jack 7 suited, possibly jack 7 off, 10-7 suited and offsuits, 9-7 suited and offsuits, and 8-7 suited and offsuits in his range pre. And that's a whole lot of 7x compared to the number of boats he can have, especially considering 7-5 offsuits through 7-2 offsuits are pretty standard folds pre in this spot. So I think, considering we can often look like we're spazzing here, with something like ace-queen, we can often look we can expect the population's probably overcalling a spot against jam, just thinking, well, I have trips, it's a good hand, I call. I think check jamming is probably slightly better than check calling, though I don't think it's a horrible mistake to check call. Fortunately, we do check jam, and well, he has a boat. He actually tank called there with a boat, so I guess against this particular play, he's more likely to start folding sevens. So it's probably not the best idea to check jam against this particular player, but against the population of players with his stats and the information we have on him, I think it's probably fine to play the hand this way. Open tens in a cutoff, pretty standard, call a 3-bet out of position, nothing else we can really do. Turns of first real decision points, I think it's close between value betting and checking and check calling. I think we should probably be value betting this and check calling queens. The reason being that this is far less vulnerable to his folding range. So, for instance, if he decides to start 3-betting Queen Jack offsuit, maybe he starts folding Ace Jack to return bet, which would be a bit absurd, I think, but some people will. And of course, if he has any queens or jacks that he's going to fold, then that's a very good result for us. Whereas queens, we're only vulnerable to an ace, and he's not folding an ace off and on this turn after checking back the flop. So I think the check is a mistake, which I don't think is a big one. But when we check, we obviously need to check call. It's super high in our range for checking twice, and the river's an ace. Now this is a pretty interesting spot. I mean, we have to start by checking. We do have some ace-x in our range, and in fact, I suppose we don't have to start by checking. Considering we should have plenty of ace-x in our range for taking this line, probably ace-10 suited and all the combos of ace-queen and ace-jack. I think we can probably develop a donking range on this river. If we do that, it's uncertain whether it would include tens as a bluff, but I think probably if it has to include tens as a bluff, we just want to go for a smaller sizing, because realistically, tens wins too much at showdown when we check to use it as a bluff. But yeah, we do start by checking, and our opponent bets $15. Now, this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Firstly, although he'd start by checking back, I think, with a lot of ace-x, I struggle to see why he'd start betting a turn with them. I don't think he's going to be capable with. I don't think he's going to be capable to value bet the river with queens here. And I think certainly he should pretty much always bet the flop with a king. So I think the only real value hand he represents here is aces specifically, which checks back the flop, probably with the ace of hearts. Now, I'm not sure how often he's bluffing. That's the argument which can lead to a fold here. That's massively affected by what his pre-flop range is. If his pre-flop range never includes suited connectors as a 3-bet bluff here, which I think it probably should, I think it's become standard enough to 3-bets, to call 3-bets out of position that you can start using some equity hands like suited connectors as 3-bet bluffs in position. Then, if it never has suited connectors in its pre-flop range, then I think we should fold, because it's tough to see what he's bluffing with here. It's probably Queen Jack offsuit specifically that he's bluffing with here. Maybe. I think that's essentially it. If he does have suited connectors in his pre-flop range, then we can call, because he can show up with plenty of bluff combos here, and he reps about three value combos. So, given this information, I think, and given that we don't have any specific reads on his 3-bet range, I remember not looking at the time, we just know he's 3-bet aces in the past. I think we can assume that the population does 3-bet suited connectors here pre-flop often enough that we should be calling here. on his ace river. It's not the scare card, it seems. He shouldn't really have many ace-X in his range. And he shows up with aces without the ace of hearts. I think he should probably be betting the flop with that and then starting to check back turns, but I don't think it's a big mistake to check back the flop. And I think he played the hand pretty well after that. A guy opens the cut-off for 3.5x. We're sort of assuming he's a bit of a fish from that, and he's 30-18 over 45, so he's probably just a bit fishy. We 3-bet to 3x plus a big blind and a small blind, all standard. He calls, we flop top pair, and because we have this kind of read, it's a bit fishy, we're just going to go for 3 streets here. So bet flop, he calls, bet turn, he calls, and some might start checking this river, but I think it's an absolutely mandatory value jam. I think especially against fishy players, you can see calls with king queen, king 10, sometimes a jack, sometimes queens if they have it pre. And I think also, especially the worst players are sometimes going to raise 2 pair plus on the flop, whereas they're very rarely going to raise naked pair hands. So I think it's a pretty mandatory jam, and he calls with jack 9 of hearts, and that's just absolutely terrible. His calls pre and on the flop are fine. The turn starts getting very thin without any outs against a strong hand, and the river is just appalling. Another ace king hand, we get 3-bet small by the big blind. I think it's a pretty big leak to be 3-betting 3x out of position against a min raise. You give your opponent such excellent odds to continue that they really want to be continuing with close to everything they open. So because of this, and also because of his stack size, we're sort of assuming he's a bit of a fish, so we throw the 4-bet sizing that we'd use against regs out of the window, and we just pot it, I think. And he calls. We flop trips. He donks for pots, and I think, to be honest, raising here would be a mistake. I think we just want to let him spaz off. If this were the turn, I think raising would be okay, because we do get the rest of his stack with when he has a draw and misses a river, whereas we wouldn't otherwise if he chooses not to bluff the river. But here I think there's more merit to calling because we get the rest of his stack when he has a draw anyway, and we allow him to continue spazzing if he is spazzing. So I think the turn plays itself. Obviously we turn quads and get shoved into, we call, and well, he has pocket 8, so tackling him is well after that. So if a fish opens, based on his stats, he's played 0-0 over 3 hands. We don't really know he's a fish, but he was one tabling and he has a short stack, so we're assuming if he's a fish. Because we expect him to flat a lot of 3-bets out of position and fold a c-bet, we want to be isolating a pretty wide range, and king 10 isn't strong enough to call, but we can value bet top pair sometimes, so I quite like 3-betting it. We get called, we flop top pair. Against regs, if we showed up here, I think this should be a check back. We want to protect our checking range with some king x. But against a fish, I think it's strong enough, especially on a texture where they can have some draws. Jack 10, 9, 10 we block a little bit, but they're still going to call. Probably ace high calls. He might even have 6-5 suited pre, or God forbid 9-6 suited. But I think we definitely want to start by value betting his flop. He raises huge, and I think you basically get 2 types of fish here: those that never have anything, and those that only ever do this with the nuts. So I think you basically have close to 100% equity half the time and close to 0% equity half the time. I think folding top pair here would be a mistake, because fish sometimes do this with top pair weak kicker. I think I'd probably fold queen so it's close, but I'm just not folding top pair here. I think this is probably better as a call, but I don't think jamming's bad either. And we do jam, and he calls with ace king. So obviously our opponent misplayed the hand. I think every street is misplayed, but I think the fact that he does show up with ace queen, A, lets us take a nose, and B, doesn't necessarily indicate that we've played the hand badly. Middle position opens, he's a tightish reg, and I think this guy was a fish, just went for the hood to come up. Yeah, he was one tabling 67.22, he calls, and we squeezed. The opener is folding 60% squeezed over a small sample, but is folding 62% to 3 bets overall, so we can assume he's folding decent amounts of 3 bets. Also, this hand doesn't really play that well. Heads 3-way in a single raise pot, especially deep. We flop top pair, we're never sure about whether we dominated, so we kind of want to reduce the SPR and ideally get a heads up. But we get called in 2 places. We flop complete air on a super connected board, so on the flop it's just a very standard give up. There's absolutely no merit to c-betting here. With the 2 combined are probably going to underfold to the flop anyway, and we have basically no equity compared to the rest of our range. Sometimes we might start c-betting with king queen of diamonds, but I think that's too thin anyway. We turn a king, and middle position bets. I think we can assume that he's often value oriented here with a fish in a pot, but he has enough bluffs with equity. He might even bluff jack 10 here. That's even when the fish calls, and we're just giving him a super wide range. We can overcall. Probably folding rivers if he bets again though, because the fish he can't expect to fold too often, and we're representing a very strong range here. This is basically the bottom of our turn calling range. In fact, we probably just have king X here for calling the turn. The river's a 10, and the fish bets 450 into $50. Sometimes the reg has us beat, sometimes the fish has a beat, but we're getting 12 to 1. We're getting 13.17 to 1, so we simply can't fold. No point in raising though. I think raising is far too thin. It's just a case of what do we hope to get called by. And when we get called by middle position, I just don't think we're good all that often at all. But obviously we don't, after he checks the river with a fish in the pot, we expect him to be folding the overwhelming majority of the time. So yeah, we run into middle set, which I think he should be value betting the river with, and ace king. But I think that's the top of their respective ranges, so I think the river call is fine. Guessing 5.5 to 1. I think 5-3 seized is a decent peel pre against 2 regs. I think this guy was slightly nitty. Yep, he was. I don't think we really want a donking range as a big blind in this kind of spot in general, just because we have such a wide range pre-flop. This is very tough for us to have range advantage on any flopping at all, especially given the button has called as well, and he's going to be calling with a similar type of range. It's probably a narrower range. So when we see a best in a call, the thing is, if we call here, we're not actually that delighted to see a flush card come. Because there are so many flush draw combos, all of which are obviously better than ours in both our opponents' ranges, that we're probably not looking to raise if we hit a flush. So I think, considering that, and thus we don't really mind raise folding this hand, I think this hand makes pretty good check raise 3-way on this board. I think it's pretty standard check call if we were heads up. So I think that should be I think check raising to a fairly standard size should be a pretty decent play. And considering we rep stats pretty well here, we also have Queen 8 suited and Queen 4 suited on pre-flop range. We should expect 2 folds pretty often. The button calls. Now, considering we're a reg in a big blind, we expect him to raise his sets on a flop pretty often. So I think he has a lot of Queen X in his range, sometimes flush draws, but I think he folds enough of that to 1 more barrel, and certainly 2 more barrels, and of course we've now picked up the gut shot, which is good, to justify barreling off. So we bet 13 on the turn. We're not leaving a huge river SPR here, but I think considering the board texture is so wet, it's a close argument between betting tiny with our range and over jamming blank rivers, but also when the draw is complete, we don't really want to be jamming for that much on rivers, because we wouldn't have a very bluff heavy range. So I think about $13, which is slightly larger than normal for our turn SPR here. Normally I'd bet about 11. I think $13 is about the right sizing. He calls, so now I'm starting to think he'd probably start folding a lot of flush draws on his turn. So I think he has Queen X a decent amount of the time. Sometimes 2 pair, but I don't see what he calls with pre. River 5, and I think it's a pretty significant mistake to check and assume this is showdown value. Not only do we lose to all his made hands before this, but also we can pretty much expect him to always jam when he doesn't have a made hand. I mean, considering he's 17-6 over a small sample, I'm not sure that's quite as absolute as it would be against other players, but I think certainly we can expect the population to jam most hands which are worse than ours on this river if we check them, and check calling is just going to be suicidal against his range. I think he does still have some Queen X. Sometimes he has some draws, which, and obviously if he has Jack 10 of diamonds, he probably gets it here playing this way, 10-9 of diamonds. And I think he has enough hands like that. I think Queen X probably folds against a river jam just because people will probably perceive the 50 and LZM population to not be bluffing very often in this spot, even though all the draws missed. Thus, I think we can definitely get away with jamming this river. So I'm just going to pause the video for a moment here. You probably won't notice the pause. I'm just going downstairs for a couple of hours, so I'll see you later. So I'm hoping you didn't notice much of a pause there, even though I was gone about 3.5 hours. Moving on to the next hand, King Queen off in middle position, pre-standard open, get called by the big blind. We're 100 big steep. Against anyone, this is a pretty standard c-bet. It's one of our best bluffs on this board. We don't really have any showdown value, so I think betting is certainly preferable to checking. We also sometimes fold out some unpaired hands, and indeed hands which beats us, which so in general is a good spot to bet. So our opponents fold 6 out of 10 c-bets, so if anything we'd want to widen our c-betting range rather than narrow it. He check raises. Now it's the first time we've seen this so far. I think King Queen is just too high in our range here to fold. We can use this as a bluff on later streets, and we can always hit something and stack him. So I think considering if we hit something we hit the nuts as well, that's certainly a relevant point. If we had some double gutter, or I don't know what exactly that would be, but some double gutter in which most of the hands we hit were not in fact the nuts, and then I'd be much less inclined to continue. So we do turn nuts, and clearly we're going to bet this turn when checks too. I think the fundamental point is sizing. He can certainly check sets on this turn. I think he's probably going to be checking too much with value hands in general because of the 4-straight nature of the board. Realistically, we don't have that many ace-x in our range, but he's probably not thinking enough about that. But with that said, we don't have many bluffs, so we don't want to be betting that large. And this will just be a go up with a lot of his bluffs as well, I think, although it's tough to see what bluffs he has on the flop, which don't have at least a pair on this turn. So I think the optimal sizing is probably about... It's going to be something which allows us to shove rivers. $10 leaves us 35 into 37 on the river. But I think that's a little bit too much to have behind, because our range, although polarized, won't really have many hands which want to bluff here on the river, so I think 13 would be better. It will leave us 32 into 43, which is far preferable. I have no idea why I bet small. I think at the time I'm probably just assuming his range is weaker than it is, so I can just exploitatively bet small with my entire range, and and force him to make a really tough decision about whether to start calling with some ridiculously weak hands out of position with a street to play, or start overfolding this spot quite significantly. But considering what I said about how he might check sets on this turn a decent amount, I don't think that's the right play. The board pairs on river, I don't think that's fantastic. I also think I'm pretty confident he's going to barrel an 8 on the turn. So I think his range for check calling the turn after check raising the flop. The parts we beat on this river card are basically Jack 10 and very low. So let's think about it. Set, take this line, get here all the time. Ace-X barrels a turn, King-Queen barrels a turn, Queen-8 barrels a turn. His bluffs make a pair on the turn, but probably don't call all that often. And certainly they're not calling a river bet, so that's not a big deal. So that's not a big deal in our consideration anyway. So I think on this particular river card, we're not actually ahead of his calling range, of his continuous range against the bets. So I think we should check behind. Incidentally, because we are checking behind a hand which is so high in our range, I think it indicates that he ought to develop a donkey range on this river. He doesn't really have many bluffs, so he'd probably have to donk like $5, but it's certainly a good spot to develop a donking range. And he shows up with top boats, and yeah. So I think that's a good spot for us to save money by not betting that river. I think the turn bet is too small. That's the way the hand is misplayed. We're flatting here because this is whaling the big blind. I think certainly it's an easy flatter for in a big blind, and although King Jack off doesn't play all that well three-way, I think from what we've seen of this opponent so far, I think I have a couple of notes. I'm pretty confident that it's still going to be hugely plus EV to keep them in the pot. Yeah, okay, so I've seen this opponent stack 40 big blinds with 9-5 suited, so that's the type of whale we're talking about. And also they're possing every street post flop. However, they fold, so we do see a flop heads up, we flop a gut shots, and it's not really a soft sort of board we'd want to check raising range on, so I think this hand would be a pretty mandatory check call. But as it happens, it checks through. We turn the nuts. I think our range is clearly stronger here, considering our opponent checked back the flop. So I think we certainly need to start by betting this hand. Sizing, I think about 250 is appropriate. It's a reasonably wet board, but our opponent won't have a huge amount of draws because he'll probably see bet a lot of backdoors anyway. But they'll still probably want to defend a reasonably appropriate amount against his bets. So I think that's probably a little bit small, but it's not terrible. We get called. And the river doesn't look great on first sight because we no longer have the nuts, but realistically, the hands our opponent beats us with here are queens he might check back the flop with, and 10s and 10-9. And those are essentially the only hands which beat us here. So we're definitely going to start by betting, because he might call with jacks, whatever queens he checked back the flop with at 9, even ace high sometimes. So I think we want to be betting about 5.25, just a pretty standard size. But the interesting thing about this hand is what we do when our opponent raises. Now, it's clear at this point in the hand that our hand is pretty close to being a bluff catcher. The only worse hand he can be raising for value here, I think, is Jack 8. Ace-10 would be a pretty thin value raise, and if he is raising Ace-10, I think this is just going to be a snipsy snap because there are going to be so many value combos we beat in his range. But Jack-8 is often going to see bet that flop or even fold pre. I mean, I think Jack-8 suited should almost certainly be opening the cutoff there with fish on the button and in the big blind, but this guy, well, he's playing 28-21, so he probably would open it. But what's the point? If he doesn't raise Ace-10, then this isn't actually all that good a hand to call with. Because if he is turning some hands into bluffs here, they're likely to be stuff with not blockers. So, for instance, with blockers, without having enough showdown value to call. So, for instance, he might turn a Jack into a bluff because it blocks King Jack. He might turn Jack-8. He might turn a King into a bluff because it blocks King Jack. But his blockers to our hands, which make pairs, he isn't going to use the bluff because they're strong enough to call. However, with much of the rest of our range, we do block his value hands rather than his bluff. So if we have a Ace Queen here, we block Ace Jack, but we also block Queen 10 if he has it, and pocket queens. If we have a 10 here, we block basically everything. So I think this hand is certainly not the best hand to call with, even though it's stronger than a lot of hands in terms of absolute strength. I'd certainly rather call with Ace-10 here than this hand. I think against this opponent it probably is a spot where we want to be calling, just because he's probably capable of bluffing this spot. I've seen him make some moves in the past, so I can't. So, like, unlike most of the population of 50 and Zoom, we can't completely rule out bluffs. So I think it's probably just about still a call, especially considering we're probably going to be betting a whole lot as a bluff and also betting as wide as any Queen X value here. But it's not a fist pump. So he shows up the 10-9, and it's just a bit of a cooler, really. Open Jacks under the gun, get called by a fishy player in under the gun +1. This is a very simple hand, get squeezed by a guy with 40 big blinds. Because he's got 40 big blinds, and A, we're assuming he's pretty bad because the minimum buy-in in Zoom is 50 big blinds. B, we don't mind stacking off jacks nearly as much as we would for 100 big blinds as under the gun, so we're going to 4 bets. But now middle position jams, and the button calls. I think this is a pretty clear fold. Middle position's range should be ridiculously strong in this instance. It's certainly a strategy of some players to flat everything, their entire continuance range, in middle position against under the gun. And certainly the hands that they want to stick in here are going to be more along the lines of queens, kings, and ace-king that they might flat. Moreover, this player doesn't look extremely fishy. 35-24 isn't the greatest player ever, but it's not a whale by any means. And they've also got a live range behind them for quite a bit of money to worry about. So I mean, this guy isn't folding very often after squeezing properly. So I think it's a solid spot to fold, and well, it turns out we would have, I think, profited on the hand making a call there, but I think that this is a best case scenario with middle positions range. Open ace jack. I can't remember if this guy was a fish or not, so I'm just going to search my star notes. Stars, yes, I've got him tagged as a fish. No other reads. I assume he was just one tabling and lots of reason for the notes. So we are going to start by betting pretty big. This is much bigger than I'd normally bet on this texture. Get called, seems a pretty standard turn. Barrel for value 2. Because there are a lot of draws now, we should probably be betting even bigger than this against fish, maybe 675. Get called again, but it's not a huge deal. The interesting spot comes in deciding whether to value bet this river. So if we quickly look at what we can get called by that we beat, some fish are going to call with ace 9, king 9, queen 9 here, so we can add a few combos of those that we beat, maybe 10 9. If they've flatted queen's races pre, they're probably just going to be too attached to those to fold. We're definitely going to get called by king jack, queen jack, jack 10. Oh god, a 10 beats is, wow, I'm slow tonight. So there are far fewer combos there than we would have hoped. Sometimes, I think against a fish, this is certainly much closer to a value bet, not only because they're going to raise wide, because they're going to call wider than they should, but also because they're going to raise a lot of their stronger hands on the flop. However, that also includes Jack X, so it leaves not a huge range which they're calling, and I think a decent chunk of that range is 10x. So I think it's probably close between betting about a third pot and checking. I think I marginally prefer checking on review, just because I think they're going to have 10x too often when they do call, and definitely some boats as well. But I think betting small is probably not too bad, but certainly we're better folding against the jam. So, yeah, I think that value bet is too ambitious, and moral of that hand is really don't go for value bets which are insanely ambitious, as you might be inclined to. We're flatting an undergun open here with 2s. Normally it's a fold. I'd be calling 7s through queens here for pocket pairs, but because undergun's a fish, there's also a probable fish on the button, so it's going to be a more profitable flat. So we flat bottom sets. Undergun C bets pot. We call, pretty standard. So trying to keep the other fish in. Now undergun barrels potted, just in case he has Jack 10 or some draw completes. I think it's probably best just to stick the rest in now than to wait. And there's really not much else to talk about. I think I just marked this hand for a very cursory review about whether it's better to jam or call the turn, but I'm pretty confident it's better to jam, considering he can sometimes be spazzing ace jack, jack 10 here, jack 9, and those are more likely to call off than triple barrel. Moreover, when a fish pots it, they're very rarely going to fold to a raise, just because they're doing it at such a strong range, and he shows up with ace king. So nice hand, standard, etc, etc. Ace jack offsuit under the gun, gets squeezed by a very good regular in the big blind. I talk poker with this guy a lot. He's very competent, and it's worth noting that we're 200 big blinds deep. However, the small blind is a fish, so he's probably squeezing wider than normal. I talked about him with this hand after the event. He thinks ace jack is strong enough to flat here to try and keep the fish in the pot. Offsuit I'm not so confident about. So I'm going to prefer 4-betting here or folding more often than not. Obviously, because the hand's marked, I didn't just fold it, so we do elect to 4-bet. The small blind folds, and our opponent calls out his position. We're playing a 4-bet pot about 200 big blinds deep, which is always going to be a pretty interesting spot, especially against competent opponents. I know this player certainly has a penchant for flatting 4-bets, so I'm assuming he's doing that with a pretty wide range, especially against a sizing, probably close to his entire squeeze range. So we've flopped top pair. We're not delighted on this board, especially considering I'm not sure he's going to have a 5-betting range here pre-flop, so we can definitely have aces and kings and ace king. And for that reason, I think that this probably plays best as a check back. It's certainly an absolutely mandatory check back as with a club. Sort of to protect your checking back range on flushing turns, but also to in order to what am I talking about? Yeah, so you protect your checking back range on flushing turns if you check back when you have a club, but also you block some of their calling range. So, for instance, I'm not sure how he plays Queen Jack of clubs pre. I'm not quite sure how big a fish this player was, but I know they're one tabling, so I'm assuming he has more information on him than me. So I can't determine his exact squeezing range pre. But if he has Queen, if we block Queen Jack clubs, which is good. When we check back, we block some of his calling range because I doubt he's folding any flush draw there. We block jacks with the jack of clubs, etc. So I think that makes it pretty mandatory check back with the jack of clubs, but I think it's still a check back because we're not looking for 3 streets here without the jack of clubs, and because we're checking back what's a relatively strong hand on this board, I think it's probably a spot where we want to be checking back most of our 4 betting range. I think we can probably still bet ace king, although the problem is here though that our 4 betting range is constructed in such a way that it's usually either flops a pair on this flop, even though that might be an underpair like queens, or it's flops a flush unless it's suited, or it's flops complete air, so it's just a suited connector like 8-7 of hearts, which just has absolutely nothing here, so probably doesn't want to start betting at all. So I think this is probably a good flop on which we should to check back our whole range on, especially considering if he checks a turn we can start betting. We can probably start betting about 20 to get 70 into 70 on the river and still threaten stacks that way. So flop checks through, the turns a queen. When he bets, it's just a spot that we simply can't fold. It's close to the top of our range. We have a gut shot. We're nearly always good if we hit an ace or a jack as well. Not so much because the ace improves our hand to beat hands where we're behind, but it reduces the number of value combos he can have in this spot. So yeah, we simply can't fold there. We river gin. I mean, realistically, neither player has many flushes here, because most of the suited hands in any given pre-flop range are going to be ace-x of clubs or strong king-x of clubs. Sometimes you might see queen-jack clubs in either player's range, but it's not going to be that common. Certainly, I'd always be flatting it against a squeeze. So it's only our opponent who can have that sort of hand here. But on the other hand, I might sometimes 4-bet some lower suited connectors, and then if I was really thinking about how to play my range, check back the flop here. So our opponent starts by checking now. Now I'm not sure if he's decided if he wants to range check this river or not. To be honest, I think it's probably a mistake too. I think he's probably going to start turning jacks into a bluff on the turn if he has them, and we're going to fold jacks. So I think he has more jack X than we do. So it's definitely a spot where he's going to want a betting range. So this leaves his river range capped. So I think he very rarely has us beat here. And it's a pretty clear value bet. The issue is to decide on sizing. Now, again, let's consider our range. We 4-bet pre. Now what sort of range might we do that with? Value hands, I mean, this deep we can probably 4-bet aces through queens and ace-king pre, even though I think that's absolute suicide against the 3-bet run. They're going to open 100 deep. 200 deep it starts being okay. We probably have some bluffs, which are hands like these, are obviously broadways, which all have showdown value or straights. I mean, sometimes you can even value bet 2-pair here. Strong 2-pair in sets. We also have possibly some small suited connectors, so like, well, I say small, I mean like 9-8 suited. But those aren't really value combos, because I'm pretty confident even I'd always bet the flop with flopped flushes. So, and I'd fold the turn with complete air, so I'm guessing we don't really have any of those in our range. So I'm guessing the moral of the story is that our range is actually incredibly strong on this river. We don't have any bluffs, really. We'd have to start turning King Queen into a bluff or something to have bluffs here, and that's pretty absurd. So I think the correct bet size for that reason is something which is going to make him consider having a calling range. I think I'm probably literally never bluffing when I bet this river, so I think, depending on how much I expect him to think, and because I know he's a very good player, I expect that to be a very decent percentage of the time. I think the optimal bet size is probably something in the region of $5 to $8. Just to get him wondering whether I'm turning King Queen offsuit into a bluff, or Queen 10 offsuit into a bluff. And unfortunately I wasn't thinking as well as that at the time, so I ended up betting $32.50, which is obviously far too big. He can just fold everything and get away with it here. So yeah, he later told me he folded ace queen with the queen of clubs, which is clearly not a good result for us here. If he's folding ace queen, we're almost certainly betting too big, because he doesn't really have that many sets pre. I mean, it depends whether he starts flatting aces, kings, and queens, but he certainly has queens and tens, I think. But he's certainly calling a very narrow range and correctly exploitatively folding against our range if he's folding ace queen there. So I think he played the hand better than I did in this case. Thank you, Grindy School. I've been a Definite Article. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'm going to continue this review with the second part just presently, but you probably won't see it for a week or so. So I've been a Definite Article. Good luck at the tables.